You ever float on your back in the ocean at night and feel like the world has simplified down to nothing but the skin of the water and the sky above it? No phones, no lights, just you and the small orchestra of waves and wind. That's where these three stories begin, not at a cliff or in some abandoned asylum, but out there where the horizon dissolves, where distance and depth stop making sense. They are true, at least true to me and to the people who were there. 3 nights, 3 witnesses, 3 moments when the sea did something that didn't sit right afterward. I should tell you who I am straight away, because that matters. I'm not a paranormal investigator or some washed-up thrill-seeker. I was a college kid who swam a lot, day and night, mostly at the Jersey shore. Then later I learned to dive. For each of these moments I was either a swimmer who misread the ocean, a camper who ignored the quiet rules the coast seems to keep, or a diver who pushed just a hair past prudence. I say that because hindsight is always cruel. Looking back, I can list a dozen things I shouldn't have done. But in the moment you don't think in lists. You listen, you move, you act. If you like this kind of thing, true ocean stories that play with the edge between natural and inexplicable, stick with me. There are more like this. But let me start with the one that still makes my chest tighten when I picture that green mark on my ankle. It was a late summer night, college summer job, the kind of internship that paid in experience and free coffee and left you drifting through long evenings. The beach had emptied out earlier. The lifeguards had packed up hours before, and the parking lot lights had been switched off. It was that window when the shore belongs to a smaller number of people. Couples where whispers hang heavier than usual, people walking dogs with orange eyes from flashlights, and a few of us who thought the dark water felt like a private pool. I wasn't alone in every sense. 2 friends had tagged out hours earlier, and I told myself I was just going to float for a bit, let the tide carry me while I watched the stars. The water was warm enough to make you lazy, the kind of heat that makes a place feel safe even when it isn't. I kicked out past the breakers and lay still. The sea holds you differently at night, weightless, face to sky, horizon a blacker black. I remember the taste of salt, the scrape of a jellyfish I didn't see, the way the moon threw a silver path across waves, everything simple and small. Then I heard it. A voice, not muffled by distance so much as imprinted on the dark like sound being carried in a cup. "Help!" it said, once, then again, high, a little frantic. You'd think the first instinct would be to call for help, but the beach was hushed. My brain did the cruel arithmetic. Lifeguards gone, other people not close, me in the water. You tell yourself you can't just listen if someone needs you. I don't know why it felt obvious I should be the one to go out toward it. Maybe because I was young and thought heroics would be quick. Maybe because the sound cut through the night and made everything else seem mute. It wasn't a single unmistakable cry, more like intermittent thrashing and a voice lost in the churn. At first it seemed to be closer to shore, over the stretch of dark where the breakers closed like teeth. Then the sound slipped sideways along the horizon, and whatever coordinates I assigned to it kept sliding away as if the sea was folding. Distance blurred. You try to follow sound over water, and water lies to you. It can make something half a mile out feel 3 meters away, and a meter away feel like a continent. I started swimming toward the sound. I was competent. I had hours of day swimming under my belt. The first strokes were confident, almost casual, and then I realized the rhythm of the water had changed. The surface dropped in temperature like someone had opened a switch. There was a distinct line in the water. One side held the warm, sticky summer water. The next was a cool band that bit at my calves. I don't want to call it a thermal line with the authority of a scientist. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. What I can say is that the water changed abruptly, and the voice seemed to be just over that line, or perhaps carried on it like a buoyant whisper. The cries got louder. Panic has a texture. It rattles your teeth and compresses your lungs. You start breaking your own rhythm. You try to keep stroke, but the current likes to take a young, sure person and rearrange confidence into panic. I kept going because it felt like the only humane thing to do. I remember thinking weirdly about the movie scenarios where a lone swimmer is the hero, and I'm ashamed to say I let that straw make me move. Then the voice stopped. Not faded out, it ceased as if someone had stopped singing mid-note. Silence opened like a mouth. That silence was worse than the voice. For a long breath I hung there, treading water, listening for some drift of sound. Nothing. The sea took advantage of the quiet, a million indifferent ripples murmuring, but no voice. My first real thought was that maybe someone in a boat had been calling. Maybe they'd driven off, or the tide took them, or they climbed onto a buoy. Every plausible explanation perched in my head like a spider on a wall and refused to be a comfort. I started to turn back toward shore. The swim home felt like working through honey. My lungs burned. The way the water moved under me wasn't the same. It was like someone else had learned to swim in the same rhythm and pulled the sea to that cadence. My arms felt heavy, my legs felt like they'd turned to steel, and then something grabbed my ankle. Not pressure, not the mild brush of seaweed. It clamped like a hand or a cord and pulled hard. There was a taut, concentrated force that yanked me downward in the blink of a second. My body rotated. Water filled my mouth. For the first time in my life, I was terrified in a way that made thinking impossible. You go from reasoning to animal. I kicked, I clawed, I heard my own spluttered curses and the thump of my heart in my ears. Whatever had hold of me hooked, then tried to pull me deeper with a deliberate, not entirely random motion, like an animal that knows how to secure prey. I broke free, I don't know how. Maybe it loosened. Maybe I managed to roll and put my weight on it. Maybe it wanted something else and decided I wasn't worth it. All I remember is surfacing with my face raw from the taste of brine and the side of my foot burning from some abrasion. I swam in a wild flurry toward the shore until my shoulders hit sand and I collapsed forward onto my knees. I must have coughed up seawater for 5 minutes straight. The beach light painted everything a sick yellow. I didn't wait to see if anyone had seen me. I remember staggering up and stripping off my trunks like I wanted to get out of that skin. My ankle throbbed where whatever had grabbed me had left a ring of greenish bruising. It looked almost like a stamp, circular, not jagged, with a greenish halo that didn't match the usual purple of a bad bruise. It didn't hurt so much as it felt wrong. I could tell instantly that it would be visible for days. I slept in my car the rest of the night, just because the idea of being within 3 yards of the water terrified me. The next morning, I made the awkward rounds of friends. They were skeptical, mostly amused that I had decided to go on an unsupervised rescue mission. Someone suggested it could have been a fishing line. Someone else joked about drunken kids with ropes. I accepted the rationalities because that is the comfortable thing to do. In the mirror, the mark on my ankle still looked as if it had been painted green with a thumbprint. For 2 days, that circle did not fade. It stayed, defined and stubborn, like a small, embarrassing badge. People at work asked about it, and I told them I tripped on a ladder or something ignoble. Admitting you were in the water at night alone and something yanked you is a story that invites questions you don't want to answer, questions about judgment and safety. So the narrative leaned into plausible, mundane things, but the mark refused to be ordinary, and neither did the memory, the precise sensation of a cord tightening, of the sudden upward pressure of panic when I couldn't see what had hold of me. You'd think after something like that you'd stop going near the water at night. I told myself I would. Looking back, I know it was reckless to go out alone. I tell myself that a lot. You shouldn't have gone. But the truth is more complicated. The sea has a weird way of making you forget your fear until the moment it reminds you. It had taken something from me I couldn't name. Peace, naive confidence, whatever. And it left me with the certainty that something had been there, touching the boundary between what we explain and what we don't. I tried to find a natural explanation that satisfied me. Could it have been a misinterpreted boat sound? Could the cry have been a seal or someone on a distant jetty? Could the grab have been a tangle of kelp or an underwater snag? Sure, each of those things is possible. Each also leaves holes if you push on them. A tug of kelp doesn't leave a neat circular green mark that lingers. A boat's shout doesn't stop mid-sentence and leave the world sounding hollow. And if it had been pranksters, who would risk that? Who would go to the trouble of setting a trap like that where a single person could get hurt? The more you try to make sense of it, the more you realize the ocean isn't interested in being sensible. The other thing that unsettled me was how some elements of the night reappeared later in different forms. The green, the circular mark, that color and curve showed up again in a way I couldn't have anticipated. An echo. But at that late hour, on that smell-swept beach, I just held my ankle and watched the moon's line shiver on the sea and felt like the world had become stranger than it needed to be. I didn't night swim again for a long time. If you think that was strange, wait until you hear what happened when my friend Peter and I decided a quiet October camping trip on an empty stretch of beach seemed like the kind of small, harmless adventure two idiots would pull off. We drove out in the sort of late autumn air that smells like dry leaves and salt. The beach was almost utterly deserted, just the occasional car moving like a faraway beetle, so we picked a patch of sand under the dunes and set up a small tent. Peter had that practical, watchful energy. He double-knotted the stakes and checked the wind more than I did. He liked to be in control of the little things. That would matter later, because he was the one who wouldn't let the story go, and then refused to talk about it afterward, which made the whole thing feel heavier. It was cold in that October way, air that bites at your ears, and there was a fog or mist rolling in from the water that gave the night a soft, muffled edge. We had a small fire and 2 beers, talking about nonsense and the kind of future plans people make when they're not yet feeling the weight of consequences. The ocean at night was a dark, steady presence. The waves sounded far away and close at once, a sort of distant metronome. We noticed it first as a dot on the horizon, a pale, jarring green. At a distance, it looked like a small light, too quick to be a buoy, too steady to be a shooting star. It moved with the skittering, skipping motion of a stone across water, kept leaping and touching down further along the horizon, then jumping again. I remember wondering out loud if it was one of those new fishing lights they use now to attract baitfish to the surface. Peter laughed and said maybe someone was having a party on a distant barge. Then the light started doing something we didn't expect. It curved. It bent in a way that made no sense for a boat's light. It was moving laterally, then angled inwards, as if it were measuring the coastline like a fingertip tapping a rim. After a while it drew a slow arc that seemed to trace a circle on the black. We watched, partly because it was hypnotizing and partly because we didn't know if we should be afraid. The green had a kind of artificial glow, sickly, neon. It kept appearing to hop along the line, where the swell met the horizon, and then dimming for a beat. At one point it vanished outright, one instant there, the next gone, only to appear again further down the coast, closer, then farther, a weird mobile, skipping off rhythm with the tide. We joked about aliens for a while. We called each other ridiculous names. The humor felt like a salve to keep nerves from seizing. There was a small undertow of unease, though, because neither of us could find a practical reason for the movements. There were no boats we could see, no engines, no reflections of anything else on the water. The green light had an intelligence to its motion that didn't belong to lights attached to mundane rigs. We went to sleep in the tent with the window flaps rolled down because, stupidly, we wanted to keep looking at the stars. If I had to pin it down, I'd say we both slept fitfully. You know that kind of sleep, where your mind keeps leaning forward into the next second because it's waiting for the next thing to happen, By dawn, the air had a thin ice of chill, and the fog had brightened into a pearlescent sheet. The first light let us see the beach properly, and what we saw made both of us go very, very quiet. Around our tent, carved into the sand with a clean precision that looked almost machine-made, was a trench that formed a perfect circle. The line was foot wide, maybe a little more, and it wrapped us like a moat. Not just a shallow groove, this was a trench with a definite lip. Beyond that, down the slope toward the water, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of irregular holes punctured into the sand. The holes varied in size, shapes not uniform, some shallow, some deeper. Most of them at the lip and inside seemed dusted with a faint green. It wasn't seaweed, it was sand with a green stain, as if the grains themselves had been brushed with a moss-colored dye. Peter moved like someone trying to step over a fragile truth. He poked at a hole with the toe of his shoe and got a puff of fine, green-tinged sand into the air. It smelled like the beach, like old kelp and distant diesel, but the color was wrong in a way that made your eyes stay on it. We both started to make the rational lists. We'd been camping, maybe some prank, maybe kids with glow paint. But the circle was too perfect for a drunken game, too neatly brushed. Whoever made it had taken the time to trace a precise ring around a tent they didn't even know would end up there. And the holes, many of them small and tilted inward, looked more like the track of something that had been digging into the sand from below rather than punctured from above. Peter's jaw clenched. He wanted to leave right away. He said flatly that he'd seen enough. I remember thinking he was overreacting, calling him dramatic, joking about his sudden conversion to survivalist, until I looked at the green on my fingers from the sand and watched him back away like someone stepping away from a rabid animal. He packed with a speed that had no banter. The easy conversation of earlier had evaporated like mist. We threw gear into the trunk, the air between us suddenly full of the weight of something that had walked up out of the surf and left its footprints. We left the beach without breakfast. I kept glancing out the rear window as we drove down the dunes access road. The green dots along the shoreline, if they were dots, kept appearing and then disappearing. We didn't stop to ask any neighbors or take pictures. Peter refused to talk about it on the drive back, other than to say once, "We shouldn't have been there." He wouldn't say why, just that his gut had turned like a hand. Back in town, things resumed their mechanical course. Work, classes, deadlines. The circle and the green sand became images I had to push into a drawer. But they resurfaced in little ways. The green mark on my ankle from the night swim felt related somehow, as if the shore had a palette it used when it wanted to be noticed. The sand at Peter's fingertips came off as residue for days. When I asked him later, he insisted he'd never tell anyone about that morning except me. He didn't want it to be a story, but the secrecy only tightened the shape of the memory. The more Peter wanted to forget, the more the rest of us wanted to pin the thing down with explanations. You can be sure that we tried to rationalize. Maybe a scientific instrument had been testing something offshore. Fluorescent dye bomb tests used in research sometimes leave residues, except there was no notice, no agency vans, no signs. Maybe some kind of bioluminescent bloom briefed in odd ways. Maybe a group of pranksters with glow sticks had made an elaborate midnight show for giggles. Each of those guesses fit some data point and broke on others. A trench like that, and holes too neat for casual digging, didn't flow from a prank. Bioluminescence rarely takes on an artificial neon green shade like the kind I'd seen. We were left with an absence where an explanation should be. And the ocean, indifferent as always, kept its secrets. The circle remained a mark of a night where human logic seemed to stretch and thin. Peter's refusal to talk made the event feel like one of those things you should have pretended didn't happen until the memory wore out. Only it didn't, because things like the green stain and the trench and the hollow voice have this way of sticking. They stick to your hands, to your ankle, to your mind. We swore not to go back. We didn't, at least not together. Peter didn't like the idea of camping there again, and I didn't have a persuasive argument that wasn't shame or bravado. There was a small, stubborn humiliation to admit that two grown men had been unnerved by a light and some sand. But humiliation doesn't erase images. The green kept returning in dreams and random flashes of memory, and the idea of a circle around the tent, like a ring drawn by some indifferent compass, kept crawling under my skin. If the first night taught me that something in the dark could reach out and touch you without explanation, and the second taught me that the shore leaves physical traces you can look at with daylight and still not understand, the third story changes the scale. It takes place deep enough that you can't talk your way through it with yardstick logic. It involves a wreck and a yellow that didn't belong to anything we could comfortably name, and it ends with footage that shows nothing at all. I met Ryan through dive classes a year after that coastal season. Ryan was the kind of dive buddy you felt good about taking into deep water. Careful, calm, with a tendency to check his gauges like it was a hobby. We did a few wrecks together, nothing wild, and then signed up for a 2-tank on a cargo wreck off Roatan. The briefing was standard. Max depth limits, no decompression times, stay with your buddy, watch your PSI. People always smile and nod at that part of the brief like it's the prelude to a map you already know. We knew the numbers. That's why we trained. The wreck itself was big and rusted and had been down long enough to have its own ecosystem. You get the sense on these dives that you're visiting some abandoned city. There are rooms with doors eaten away by time, long corridors where fish hang like curtains, and decks that host colonies of anemones that look like flowers on alien stems. We descended in a line of 6 divers, each pair spaced and breathing down the slow hiss of regulators. The profiles were set. We knew where we were supposed to be and planned our ascent windows accordingly. At depth, things change in ways that sound clinical until you're the one experiencing it. Colors compress. Depth does weird arithmetic on sound and vision. Nitrogen narcosis is a possible thing. Some people feel only a light euphoria at a certain combination of depth and gas mix. Others feel it like a haze across the mind. It's a known risk we trained for. We had checked our dive computers. We were within what we thought was reasonable, but not by a big margin. I don't want to invent numbers I can't verify, so we'll say we were toward the deeper end of our plan, and that later either of us would think that small shift mattered. We came upon the wreck's main deck like you come into the center of a ruined room. It was mostly quiet. The water had a clarity that made the distance feel closer than it was. I was scanning for a lionfish I remembered seeing on a prior visit, when something caught the far edge of my vision, a yellow form, brilliant, almost like a living lamp. It was sitting on a piece of the deck as if it owned that square of metal. For a few seconds I thought it must be a big anemone, or a cluster of some bioluminescent organism catching the light in a strange way. Except it wasn't that. Up close it had the rate of movement and the softness of a jellyfish. But in shape it was wrong, thicker, more like a translucent disc with filaments curled underneath, and the color was an electric yellow that didn't fit the muted palette of depth. It was luminous without casting light. It glowed the way a lantern glows when someone tints the glass. The texture looked almost layered like tissue paper stacked and folded, and when a small current brushed it, the jelly-like folds cohered like a mouth closing. Ryan saw it too. We both did, and that's the unsettling part. You can hallucinate alone. Shared hallucination is a different knot. He cut his breath short and pointed with a gloved hand. The rest of the team seemed to register it as well. There was this tense, drawn-in feeling among everyone, like when a room suddenly gets quieter. We approached slowly, because that's what you do, respect the life forms and the wreck. But something changed. Our focus narrowed so sharply that the deck and the rest of the world felt like a background to this single thing. The color held us. I was struck by how the yellow wasn't just bright, it seemed precise. The kind of hue you remember when the light is right, like the shade of a banana that's just about to be perfect. Then, like the voice at the beach, The light ended. One instant it sat on the deck like a small, perfect lamp, and the next, the deck was empty. There was nothing in the footage shot from other divers that would show up later. We felt that loss the way you feel the absence of a hand after it lets go, stunned and oddly bereft. What followed was less about the thing itself, and more about how our bodies and minds reacted. Both Ryan and I describe, in the exact same words later, a narrow period where we felt lulled, like drifting through cotton. We had a fixated attention that made movement feel both slow and essential. The dive computer on my wrist started its soft alarm, one of the beeps that tells you need to move, and in the flurry of checking gauges and signaling and trying to remember decompression schedules, we found ourselves out of sync with the rest of the group. Our ascent became abrupt. Looking back, it was reckless. We pushed the limits a little too aggressively because the mind's narrowing wants to act and rushes you. We surfaced with cold wind, hitting wetsuits and a sick, dizzy chatter that made everything too bright. On the surface, adrenaline and then confusion took over. People complained of earfulness, numbness in fingers. Some had minor symptoms that suggested a rapid ascent. We all got attention from the boat's crew. Ryan and I compared notes, and here's where the strangeness doubled down. We both used the same words to describe the yellow thing. Not just yellow, but a luminous layered disc with filaments and a banana yellow that felt almost synthetic. We both described the way it rested on the deck, like a small sun. We both said it seemed to be watching, or rather, it made us feel watched. We played the footage back on the GoPro feeds once we were back on shore. My footage showed scope, the wreck, Ryan's silhouette, a cloud of sediment where something had been, and then nothing. The frames that should have captured some blur or hint of the apparition were empty. The piece of deck where we'd swore a thing sat was ordinary metal, colonized by rust and sponge. No yellow. If you watch the footage without listening to our later testimony, it's just a normal dive tape. Bubbles, the wreck, a lens flare shaped oddly by the sun's angle. There was no obvious trick of light that would produce the image we both insisted we'd seen. Medical staff later chalked the physical symptoms up to rapid ascent. Nitrogen narcosis was the textbook suspect for whatever vision had briefly overtaken us. It's the rational explanation, and at the time it was what we accepted, because rationality is a useful, stabilizing thing after a near miss, but there are parts that don't map onto a clean diagnosis. For one, we both described the exact same color in a way that wasn't likely to be the product of suggestibility, a specific, almost tactile description that included metaphor and texture. For another, the speed and intensity of the fixation we felt, how the whole world compressed to the yellow thing, wasn't just the anecdotal haze of narcosis. It was targeted attention, like the brain chose that one object to be alone with. We argued about it for weeks in text messages and late-night calls. Ryan was perplexed and a little unnerved. He suggested carefully that maybe there was a species we'd never heard of that could produce a brief fluorescence when disturbed. I suggested just as cautiously that the wreck might be home to weird colonies whose appearance changed with microcurrents. Both ideas were possible. Both were thin scaffolding for an image that refused to fit comfortably into a category. When we reviewed our planner and logs, we had to own that we had nudged our limits. Not gross violations, nothing dangerously illegal, but enough of a push that the risk of narcosis was higher than it would have been if we'd stayed at the upper bound of our depth profile. That responsibility sat with both of us and made the story less about mystery and more about a mistake. But the absence of image on the footage kept the doubt alive. If our brains had made it up under pressure, why were the descriptions so detailed and matching? If it had been real, why didn't the cameras capture it? And why, days later, did both of us wake with a residue of that yellow in our mind, like light behind the eyes? This is the knot that keeps me turning back to these three events. They each offer a physical remnant or a shared perception that resists tidy explanation. An ankle marked green, a circle trench with green-tinted sand, a brilliant yellow organism that refuses to show itself on film. The ocean keeps giving the same color palette in different contexts, like an artist working on variations of the same theme. Patterns emerge even when you try desperately not to see them. I should stop here and tell you to subscribe if you want more, because there's another piece to this trip, and it unfolds in a way that makes the first three incidents look like breadcrumbs, small things leading to a place that is harder to shrug off. If you felt that chill with the ankle and the circle and the yellow, there's a reason. The coast will keep offering colors. If this is the kind of thing you want to hear more of, true stories where the sea doesn't hand you answers, subscribe and stick around. There are more nights I wasn't supposed to be out, more small errors, and more moments when the line between plausible and eerie thins. For now, though, let me take you back to that October morning. We had left, Peter shaken and silent, the green on his fingers like an accusation we both avoided saying aloud. The trench around the tent sat quiet, as if it had been waiting for attention, and those holes, down by the water, glinted faintly green in the new light. We drove away, but you can't always outrun a mark on the world. The tent circle and the green sand didn't follow us home, but they followed us inside our heads. Peter wouldn't speak of it in full. He would frown and say, "It wasn't natural," and then shut down. I tried calling people who knew the beach. No one had seen anything quite like it. A local who ran a bait and tackle shop shrugged and mentioned strange things washing up sometimes. Glow algae, bits of discarded netting, fluorescent survey markers. But he said the circle description made his eyebrows lift. He suggested, non-committally, that the power of suggestion on a dark night can do strange things. We didn't have proof, you see. We had a trench, a haul of green sand, and a friend whose unease turned protective into silence. That silence is a kind of scar. You can see it on a person when they refuse to tell the shape of a story because sharing it would make it real in the wrong way. Peter's silence did that. It made the thing larger. There are other symptoms that time doesn't explain away. Nights when I listen to the ocean on the shore and suddenly reach for a light in the house because my mind remembers the green as if it's a hand reaching. The ankle mark faded eventually, but it left a new wariness in me. The memory of the yellow thing on the deck keeps me from writing it off entirely as a hallucination. And seeing a path of green sand in daylight, precise and clean as a drawn circle, made me want to believe in patterns that some part of me fears. I haven't told you everything about the camping trip yet. There's more, small things that don't add up. Things Peter saw that he won't describe in detail, things I only half-witnessed because I was fumbling with a camera that wouldn't focus. There are witnesses here and there, names I won't weaponize into drama. What I will say is this. The beach left us a symbol. We left it with different reactions. He left with a refusal to revisit the place. I left with a question stuck in my throat like a seed. And that question, about what the ocean keeps and what it returns, carries over into other nights, into deeper water where cameras lie and minds fold. There's a continuity in these three moments. They are not random. They share edges. Green, yellow, silence, marks, shared perception. The sea keeps an economy of signs. We parked on the side of the dunes that morning and went our separate ways, but the story didn't end with the trip. It simply paused. The ocean doesn't need you to witness a thing at the time it happens. Sometimes it parcels out evidence at its own rhythm. A tide will reveal footprints weeks later. A color will show up in the wrong place. Or two divers will come up from a wreck with the same description of something that the rest of the cameras deny exists. The sea tests how strongly you believe in what you see and how willing you are to live with a lack of closure. There's a last thing I want to share in this part, an image that threads through all three events and keeps me awake some nights. It's the look of something that's been there, and then isn't, the void left by an extinguished light, the empty patch of deck, the circle of sand, where nothing obvious remains. It's the ocean's way of saying it keeps its own counsel. It leaves traces and waits to see whether you'll notice. When you do notice, it sometimes offers the smallest of tokens, a ring of green, a stinging bruise, a color that won't be caught on film, and then retracts like a secret withheld on purpose. I could keep going into all the little follow-ups, people we called, the small tests we ran, the conversations we had with local fishermen who have a generous patience for the weird. Those are important, but they can wait. For now, hold on to the image of that trench around our tent, and the tiny, almost fluorescent green on our fingers, and the yellow glow on a wreck that no camera would agree existed. Remember that the sea is patient. It may let slip a thing, and then, as if embarrassed or coy, it will take it back. There's more to the wreck story, what the decompression symptoms turned into, what the medics said, and a particular detail on Ryan's regulator that nobody expected. There's more about Peter and why he cut off the friendship thread for a while, and there are small, stubborn facts that won't be explained by "it was probably X," which I've kept returning to like a man checking a locked door at night. If you want to hear the rest, if you want me to lay out what happened after we drove away from that green circle, and what unfolded in the weeks after the Roatan wreck, subscribe and don't miss the next piece. There are documents, names, moments that press on the boundary between probably and I saw it with my own eyes. For now, watch the way the color repeats in your mind. The green, the yellow, the ring around a tent. Imagine the ankle mark under the fluorescent bathroom light. Think about the moment you hear something at the edge of hearing and decide whether to go toward it. The next part picks up right there, at the edge, where walking closer can change everything. We called in the next day like people do after something happens that doesn't have a neat end. Not because we expected answers, but because the act of asking felt like action. The dive operator listened, then asked us to come by the shop. He wasn't accusatory so much as flat. Someone has to be the adult after a dive goes weird. He ran his hand over the mouthpiece of his regulator like a man checking a watch he doesn't trust, and said the group had gone a little deeper than he'd planned. He reminded us about staying on profile, counted off the no-deco margins in the way instructors do to keep panic clinical. It was the sort of reprimand that sits between accountability and exasperation. Adequate, but not an apology. Medical staff at the boat's return were pragmatic. Oxygen on the surface, monitor symptoms, come in for an evaluation if anything worsened. Most of what happened next had the blandness of hospital forms and checkboxes. Names, times, boxes ticked. A few of us were given more attention. I remember the antiseptic smell and the way the text talked around two words: decompression and narcosis. They told us both were potential explanations, and that sometimes they overlap in ways your vocabulary strains to explain. They couldn't prove the yellow thing had existed any more than we could prove it hadn't. What they could do was treat the physical consequences and record the subjective accounts. We sat in that tiny office with our logbooks and our guilt. Ryan and I exchanged the same descriptions again, spooning words around the shape of the thing like people tracing a lost coin. He was quieter than usual. The strike against me had always been curiosity. The one against him, apparently, was that he didn't like being wrong. He flipped through his notes and underlined things in a way that suggested he was trying to keep the story from sliding into the ridiculous. Having him give the same metamorphic yellow felt to my own report like an anchor. It should have been proof of shared suggestion. Instead, it felt like two witnesses describing the same eerie coin. When I asked about the footage, the tech who downloaded our GoPro files was apologetic in a way that made me think he expected me to be angry. "Sometimes the camera doesn't see what you do," he said. He used the small talk of competence, angles, shutter speeds, lens flare. He replayed the clip for us in the back room 3 times, each loop erasing the memory the way a fainter trace fades from a screen. There was a cloud of silt, a silhouette, the wreck's stern sagging in the blue, then nothing. The place where we'd felt the yellow was clean metal and encrusted sponge. No smear, no glow, no recollection of volume in the pixels. It looked like a normal dive video. That mismatch, what felt undeniable to our minds, and what footage denied with the flatness of pixels, became a kind of aftercare I didn't expect. We compared notes obsessively. We checked our gauges and our breath patterns. We replayed descent times and our ascend profiles, the way you replay a bad play to find where it broke. Ryan's logs had a small, curious stain on the mouthpiece of his regulator. It was a crescent smudge of something between green and rust, faint and almost invisible to most people. He'd wiped it once and shoved it into a kit, reluctant to throw it away. He kept it like a bad receipt. Nobody could explain that smear without inventing reasons. It could have been tape residue, old algae, sunscreen, something he inhaled from the wreck. The dive master shrugged and said he didn't want to make a story of trash. Later we ran that small crescent past a friend who worked in a lab. He sent an email with an economy of caution. "Looks like organic residue," he wrote, and suggested a crude test that would take a week. We never pushed it hard enough to get results. Inertia has a way of covering evidence until it becomes myth. Peter's silence, on the other hand, carved out a different consequence. For a few weeks after the camping trip, he was reliable in a minimalist way. Texts returned, beers accepted. But when I tried to circle back to the trench and the green sand, he folded shut like a book and told me he didn't want to talk about it. That refusal hardened with time until he stopped accepting messages altogether for a stretch. He never said he thought we were imagining it. He simply removed the place from his map. He stopped camping. He stopped taking the long drives to the coast. I could see where that decision lived in him. Not exactly fear, but a rational hedging against the kind of wonder that can derail a life. His withdrawal made the beach feel like a wound we'd all been rotating fingers over, afraid to press too hard. Other people responded differently. The bait shop owner, who had shrugged at first, gave a more complicated ear to my questions when I went back a week later. He told me stories of old fishermen who talked about patches of green that appeared and vanished with the tide, of fish bellying up with odd luminescent marks, of traps and dredging and discarded survey gear. He offered practical things: bioluminescent algae, dye from research, chemical runoff. Each of those possibilities fit some pieces and left others stubbornly free. The trench didn't fit the models. The holes didn't either. The green on my ankle didn't line up with any one explanation the guy could muster. In the end, he shrugged again, in that small-town way of admitting the ocean keeps things for its own reasons. The marine biologist we reached on a shaky phone call at Indefinido was kind and careful. She said that sand can be dyed by organisms or chemicals, and that bioluminescence can produce color ranges people don't expect. She asked me to send photos of the trench, photos I didn't take because we were too scared, because Peter insisted we get out, and because the circle felt like something that would go soft under daylight. She cautioned about drawing big conclusions from small, singular artifacts. She said clusters of strange phenomena can happen naturally, especially where currents and biological blooms intersect with human debris. She offered possible mechanisms without the comforting shape of certainty. That was her job. That was also not what I wanted. That lack of closure, that slow file of possibilities without one definitive answer, has a particular weight. It pushes people to different responses. Some return to the shore 100 times to look for a pattern. Some avoid it entirely. Some write the memory down and leave it in a drawer. Ryan and I dove again. Not right away. The guilt of pushing our limits hung like a fog. But the ocean is a tangle of habit and recall, and training coats you in a kind of stubbornness that feels like responsibility. We went back because the wreck still existed, and because the work of understanding involves revisiting the thing that scared you. On the next dive, we were more cautious. We kept our computers in comfortable ranges. We breathed slower. My hands were steadier, and my attention thrummed with the electric obligation to notice without being fooled. We saw life, small fish, anemones, the cosmos of coral that insists on being beautiful even in rust. No yellow sat on the deck. The cameras recorded the same ordinary world. That absence is a form of pressure. When nothing confirms the strange, you start to examine your own mind with an unkind microscope. You ask whether the brain, starved for meaning in an alien environment, cast a message in color to itself. Sometimes it comforts me to think of all three events: the tug on my ankle, the trench around the tent, the yellow on the wreck, as different languages for the same oceanic mood. Other times I'm more suspicious. My mind sees patterns because humans are pattern-seeking animals. That doesn't make the pattern false. Perhaps there is a mechanism that would knit all the pieces together if someone with more tools and time came along. Perhaps the thing that touched me in the dark was kelp and bad timing. Perhaps the green sand was a byproduct of a seasonal bloom. Perhaps the yellow was a lens flare that synchronized in the strangest human way with what Ryan and I wanted to see. The plausible explanations are all there, tidy and useful, and I hold them like blankets against the cold. But they don't quite fit the ring's precision, or the smudge on the regulator, or the way two minds describe an impossible color with the same metaphors. The aftermath changes behavior in little ways. I stopped floating alone at night. I stopped camping stupidly close to where the dunes met the water. I stopped treating small alarms as curiosities to be tested. Ryan took a temporary break from deep wrecks. He told me later it wasn't bravery or a failing of courage, just a choice to be present in life without pressing on the edges that have cut him. Peter moved further inland for a while. He called once on a night when the rain was heavy, and we talked about nothing. He said if he ever went back to that stretch of beach, he'd go with 12 people and lights like an airport. He never did. There are other echoes, less concrete, but no less real. I dream sometimes of green circles and yellow plates, and of being pulled under by something that feels like a cord. The memories arrive as temperature more than image. The cold bite once I crossed that invisible line. The heat of the sand under my palms the morning after, the slick of oxygen masks, and the way a dive boat smells like diesel and salt and quiet confession. I find myself listening for voices on otherwise empty beaches. Sometimes I hear them, small noises that resolve into gulls or distant engines when I look, but for a second there's a frisson that feels like the world is trying to reach me just beyond my senses. I've told these stories to friends and lovers and strangers on late-night shifts at bars. Most of the time, people tilt their heads politely and fit the details into whichever explanation comforts them. Natural cause, prank, hallucination, mistake. A few people tell me they have similar things: rings in sand, marks that wouldn't go away, bright colors where there shouldn't be any. Those correspondences are small and never conclusive, but they give the impression that the ocean keeps a ledger of anecdotes, and once you start reading, it hands you pages from other people's margins. The longer I carry these 3 nights, the less interested I am in proving a supernatural thesis. I'm more interested in the ways the ocean undermines our sense of scale and certainty. It rearranges distances, it hides things, and sometimes shows them for the blink of an eye. It leaves marks that can be washed out by tides or stamped into skin. It offers sensory data that sometimes line up across witnesses and sometimes don't. That ambiguity is the real haunt. Not the certainty of monsters, but the sense that the sea isn't obliged to make sense to us. There is one last small detail that I think about more than I should. It's about thresholds. Those moments where my will to move towards something met a force that rejected that motion. The second you decide to respond to a sound or a light, you cross an invisible border. Sometimes that crossing rewrites you a little. For me, it left a green ring on my ankle. For Peter, a trench around a tent. And for Ryan and me, a yellow residue behind our eyes. Each is a tiny ledger entry the sea keeps, either as joke, as warning, or as something like a signature. We can argue about the cause until the margins wear thin, but the marks remain. So what do I want you to take away from this? Maybe nothing practical, maybe a small prudence about night swims and a respect for dive plan limits. Maybe just this: the ocean will not always reward your curiosity with clarity. It will sometimes hand you a piece of itself.